lot of people here tonight, which is for me a victory. When I started doing this work, not a lot of people were coming out. When Lee Miracle started doing this work on the streets of Vancouver 20 years ago, there was just a few
Longer
of them.
than that, sweetheart. Anyway, please go.
So, in terms of what have we achieved, we have broken the silence. Now the media reports about this. But women don't stop getting murdered. The violence is not de-escalated in any way. Impunity hasn't changed in terms of, well, we see what's happening with the Pickton inquiry now. We know from yesterday's testimony that at least 18 women's lives would have been saved if the RCMP or the police had given a damn. That's how many women were murdered after Pickton had already been arrested once and released. But Pickton is one example of something that is going on across this country, not in that way that, you know, garners media attention, but in a much more everyday, mundane way. So it really isn't about the sensational serial killers. No More Silence is really trying to educate people around the systemics of this, like the women talked about in the film. This is about getting to the land. This is about the colonizer asserting his identity that he doesn't have on this land, that he needs to assert by stamping the women of this land into the ground. Unfortunately, not only are women murdered, but they're murdered in the most heinous and incredibly violent ways. When I did the Missing Women road trip in 2004 and interviewed over 45 family members, the details of the stories literally blew my mind. It's like they need to be erased, stamped out of existence. Sometimes families get a body part and not even that. Like maybe they'll get a thigh back. Actually, the cousin of Helen Betty Osborne, who was murdered in 2004, her family never got all of her back. And of course, people know who Helen Betty Osborne was, because she's one of the women that people first talked about, and that was because the whole town was complicit in keeping that murder secret. And that's the systemic of it. It's about white supremacy, and it is about, you know, making sure that the power and the control stays in the hands of the colonizer. So we have a really big task to talk about tonight, which is, you know, now what? We have broken the silence, but we need to keep going with fostering more understanding about the systemics of this. And we want this to stop. When we were preparing this, Lisa and I, we thought about talking tonight using the medicine wheel. And we will break into 4 groups. And we're going to talk about organizing in the short term and the long term. And we're going to talk about organizing locally, right here in Toronto, and nationally and internationally. So there will be a facilitator in each group who has taken notes on this, but just some of the things that we want to talk about tonight is the February 14th March, which is coming up, and increasing the responsibility beyond No More Silence for that, and getting more community groups involved in that. I see that there are men here tonight. Men don't often show up and do this work. But in Vancouver, something very special happens that the men have been doing. I'd love to see, you know, men, hint, hint, get this idea and do this in Toronto. In Vancouver, there's always an open mic and a feast after the Memorial March at the Japanese Hall. And we need something like that to happen here. And we're so busy just organizing the march. So it'd be really great if men step forward like they do in the downtown east side, where they actually organize that whole thing. They make all the food. And so that after the march, people have a place to go and get warm and debrief and take the open mic if they want and eat. So that's like an idea that people can think about.
Reading room.
In the long term, of course, we need decolonization. We know that this isn't going to stop until we have sovereignty. So if anybody has any great ideas around that. In the shorter, long term, we need to support these kind of spaces. Sometimes it's as basic as a safe place to spend the night. Atmosa in London, Ontario has been doing amazing work that Darlene Ritchie, I'm sure, will talk about. They've turned luxury condos into social housing for Native people. Apparently when people move in, they cry because they can't believe. You know, we've got Attawapiskat where people are in tents. And there will be a demo on Friday. Get out there to the ministry and make some noise about that. So sometimes it's about those basic things like supporting Ondayon, a Native Women's Shelter, so that there's safe places for women to go. Of course, there's going to be, on a national level, we need to talk about how to change policy. The Indian Act, as was mentioned, is a huge problem. I remember from Lee's talk in the summer how important, and I agree with her, the point is about keeping the state out of this work. The state doesn't work in our interest. We have to do this work. The state took the money from the Sisters in Spirit and gave $10 million to the RCMP. The RCMP got $10 million last year, and they cut the Sisters in Spirit program. And they make it, that's their big contribution, and they'll never stop talking about how they gave $10 million to this cause. But if you find out who they gave it to the RCMP. The same RCMP that has the blood on its hand, of the Picton farmers. But Sisters in Spirit, was providing at least some research, because we don't really know how many women. Right? 600 is the names that were gathered by Sisters in Spirit from 2004 till they were cut last year. And that database is actually an issue that people have to start thinking about. Like, we don't just want that to go to the RCMP. We also, I know that the families want, to have some control over who gets that information, or at least have access to it, at least make sure we keep adding to, unfortunately, we have to keep adding to it, right? There's an initiative that Darlene will probably talk about more in her when she gets up, and in her group, the idea to circle women from the 4 directions and to take this information to the United Nations. And we have someone here tonight, Rauna. Could you stand up for a second and identify yourself? She actually has an invitation. Rauna Sami, and she will be on the International Expert Group in January that is preparing for the Permanent Forum, which is going to happen in May, and they're actually on their agenda is combating violence against Indigenous women and girls. So we have the opportunity to convey what we're doing to the UN through Rauna, which is really great. Yeah, I think also in the short term nationally, we have to think about coordinating these marches that happen in every year. That happen in every year on February 14th, but in various cities. It started in Vancouver, but now it happens in Edmonton, Calgary, London, here. And we have been always trying to coordinate our efforts a little bit, but we're always so busy just actually doing the work. What else? Also, I know that the women who are standing outside the inquiry because they have been excluded from being able to, participate in that inquiry, they need our support as well. There's enough funds to, staff huge legal teams for the police and the RCMP, of course, but not enough funds to support the Downtown Eastside Women's Center and, the women who actually have information, who were at the farm, who told the police what was happening at the farm, and were turned away because they were junkie hoes. That was basically how they were seen. And, there's people who go further and say the police were complicit. There's a reason why police handcuffs were found, among the evidence at that farm. It's also not a coincidence that the Hells Angels has a clubhouse across the street, and the Hells Angels runs the porn industry, the prostitution, sex worker, well, not the sex worker, more the prostituted survival, sex trade. The Hells Angels is definitely, a big player, but enjoys impunity. Why? Well, the police and the Hells Angels, we all know how close they are. So they, in the short term, will need our support. I know that they've already petitioned the UN to look at the sham of an inquiry. And actually that, we have a really good chance of the United Nations. This is so blatant that it actually may get the attention of the United Nations in a really big way, and it would be precedent setting if that happens. Okay, that's all I'm going to say now, and I'm going to ask Lee, Darlene, and Krista to come up. They're going to briefly recap what they talked about in July.